Could you tell us about the Pennfather Treaty of 1859 and what it meant for the Anishnaabe people of Wadding?
Land theft. That's the simple answer on that one. Pennfather treaties of 1859 are questionable. They're under some parts of them are under land claims, have been or are, because of how they were negotiated. What it essentially did was Batchewana lost their entire reserve, Thessalon as well, right? And those Thessalon and Batchewana First Nations, mainly Batchewana though, got dumped at Garden River. Partly because Augustin and Bugawajnini, of the two leaders at Garden River, welcomed them. According to some recorded oral tradition and according to spoken and according to European written documents, those two chiefs promised to treat people from Batchewana as their own because they were their relations, sharing all the rights and privileges. Later, Indian agents claimed that the people from Batchewana had the right of residency, but they had no rights to anything else, so they couldn't hunt, they couldn't fish, they couldn't cut logs or anything on Garden River's reserve because it wasn't theirs. But they could live there. I'm not quite sure how you can see the economic problems, right? You can't hunt for food, you can't, but that was the Indian agents trying to split the reserve, split the community. And it really meant Garden River lost about half its land base in those treaties. Pennfather and the people that negotiated that, including Judge Prince, the great honorable Judge Prince, were basically in it for the mineral resources that this would free up and in it for the forestry resources this would free up for their own personal reasons. And it wasn't really, and to say the least, it wasn't even a fair treaty. It wasn't even, at least, in 1850, we had forced the issue. We had brought the negotiators to the table. Our leadership may not have got the treaty they wanted, but at least they had a chance to negotiate. In 1859, from the readings and from what I've been told, there wasn't a lot of negotiation. It was, here's the treaty, if you sign this is what's going to happen. If you don't sign it, this is what's going to happen, et cetera, right? It's hugely problematic, and we've been, Anishnaabe, who fell under these different Pennfather treaties, have been trying to undo them for quite a while.
So could you tell us about what the Indian Act meant for the Anishinaabe of Wadding?
Well, when the Indian Act was created in 1876, it followed through, how do I sum this up? I teach a whole course on the Indian Act. It's like, how do I sum this up? It was based on earlier legislation, right? So under the Indian Act, various things came into play, were created or reinforced, like the marrying out provisions, right? For Anishinaabe women who married non-Indians, this meant that they were no longer Indians. Under the Indian Act, though, and the way Canadian government did things, many Indians, such as the Potawatomis from the United States, were not considered Indians in Canada. So if an Anishinaabe woman from Sault Ste. Marie married a Potawatomi man, she was a non-Indian, right? And it's like when you start thinking about this, it's like, what? But if she moved to the States with her husband, she'd be considered Indian. But in Canada, neither of them were. There were certain ways around that. It was really difficult, but this is, some of the issues that were going on. There was issues imposed where people from Garden River, if they moved into the United States and lived there for 5 consecutive years, you lost your band membership. You lost your right to treaty monies. You appear to have kept your right to claim status in Canada, and you could rejoin the band, provided the band council passed a resolution saying they wanted you added back onto the lists, and provided the Ministry of Indian Affairs, and the Minister of Indian Affairs agreed to follow through with the petition. There's a bunch of orphans. There's at least a dozen people that I found in the records for Indian Affairs that were basically, some of them were orphans. Their parents died. Their 2 parents, their mom and dad, died in the States. The family, the kids, got given out to relations in the U.S. to be looked after. A couple of them I think one of them ended up at the Carlisle boarding school in the States. And they moved back to Garden River, and the Indian agent would not recognize them as being from Garden River or having any rights because they'd lived in the States for more than 5 consecutive years. The trail runs cold on, the trail runs into, by the 1920s, they still hadn't been added to the banned lists, but it's hard to trace them after the 1920s because those membership files for the Department of Indian Affairs are still sealed under privacy laws. I know that they're still being asked to join the reserve into the 1930s, and some of them never do. The family just gives up. So that's another aspect of the Indian Act that affected people, because here in Sault Ste. Marie, you want to work, well, you go across the river, right? There's a big forestry industry over there. I mean, a lot of the Finns that migrated to Sault Ste. Marie ended up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan working in the logging industry. They just moved across the river. So if we did the same, we lost all sorts of things. So it meant that. It meant the Government of Canada imposed an elected system of governance. When Augusta died, 1890, 91, the Government of Canada imposed an elected system on our community. And ever since then, Garden River has elected chiefs, right, and elected councils. There's no more, the traditional system is gone, at least legally gone. And if we want to even attempt to recreate a version of what we had prior to 1890, the Government of Canada will not recognize it. All the recognized systems of governance on reserves have to be democratically elected, right? And even when they have these things called custom band elections, it's slight modifications to the elected system. It took our children away through imposed education curriculums where they absolutely had to go to day school. If they didn't go to day school, they had to go to a residential school. I mean, that changed in the mid-early 20th century where they could also be shipped out to boarding schools, but I mean, residential school, white-run boarding school, is there much of a difference? It imposed that the government had control over our band finances. It created the Indian agent who was in control of the community essentially until the 1960s, when then the band offices were created. It means that our elected governments, despite us electing them, are actually more responsible to Ottawa than to the people who elected them. I mean, it just undermined and tried to do so many things and has really damaged the communities in many ways. I mean, it hasn't gotten rid of everything that it wanted to get rid of. I don't think it ever could have, but just by the fact that it damaged our governance systems has affected our communities.